Welcome everybody to another episode of Pilot Kimberly. It's been a while coming. I know I promised you a video on what is gliding, and I've been talking up gliding for a little while now, but also what was important to me was that I knew there are a lot of pilots like myself who are presently out of work due to COVID-19, and the cost of flying just isn't something that they can contemplate at the moment. But gliding being quite a bit less expensive will allow you to keep at least your stick and rudder skills going, your judgment skills going, and also allow you to have some enjoyment doing, what we all love to do, which is flying. So I will bring you that episode on, what is gliding, but I haven't actually been able to get to the gliding clubs myself because I've been trying to conserve my budget. And the reason for that is that I'm actually competing in the New South Wales State Gliding Championships, which are held at Lake Keepit near Tamworth. And so I've been trying to conserve my money as much as I can leading up to that event. Now, there was one thing that I spent some money on, and actually a friend lent me the money so that I could do this. So a big thank you to Kevin for that. The equipment that I'm talking about is a portable oxygen system. So I thought what I would do is make this episode about hypoxia and oxygen systems. So let's go. So first of all, let's talk about hypoxia. Let's start with respiration. Respiration is not just breathing. Respiration is the process whereby air from outside is ingested into your body, if you like, by the process of breathing into your lungs, and the oxygen is exchanged into the red blood cells to be transported around the body to be delivered to all the cells. Now, oxygen is necessary for all living cells. The other piece that happens is carbon dioxide is exchanged and breathed out. So that is the process of respiration. Now, the process of breathing is automatic, that is, it's involuntary. Yes, you can voluntarily breathe in, but most of the time you're not actually thinking about it, it just happens. Inside our lungs, at the end of the bronchial tubes, are things known as alveoli. There are about 300 million of these tiny little air sacs. These alveoli are surrounded by capillaries containing blood, and the walls between the alveoli and the blood are very thin and quite permeable. The oxygen diffuses through the membrane into the blood, and because the blood is flowing, it draws the oxygen away. That means that there's a constant pressure gradient between the inside of the alveoli and the blood, so that gradient forces oxygen to continue diffusing into the blood. And of course the reverse exists for carbon dioxide, so it's transferred the other way, out of the blood into the alveoli. Once inside the bloodstream, the oxygen can get transported around the body because it combines with something called hemoglobin. Now, a certain amount of oxygen is required for proper functioning of the human body. The air we breathe is made up of various proportions of various gases. 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 1% other gases. The 71% that is nitrogen actually plays no part in the respiration process, which depends entirely on the amount of available oxygen. Now, the actual ratios of those various gases don't change with altitude, at least not the altitudes that we would typically fly in. What happens though is the overall pressure drops, and therefore the partial pressures, the pressure exerted by the individual gases, also drops. The significance of that is that the oxygen cannot transfer into our bloodstream effectively at high altitudes. The pressure actually halves by 18,000 feet and halves again by 34,000 feet. The partial pressure of oxygen at sea level outside the lungs is approximately 150 millimeters of mercury. Inside the lungs, though, it's about 102 millimeters of mercury. This is due to the continual presence of carbon dioxide and water vapor inside your lungs. 102 millimeters of mercury is therefore the required partial pressure of oxygen for normal human functioning. Any major reduction in the partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs will have adverse effects on human functioning. As we climb in altitude, the partial pressure inside our lungs of oxygen drops below the 102 millimeters of mercury, and this has adverse effects on the human body, in particular the brain. Surprisingly though, these adverse effects are not particularly noticeable up to about 8,000 feet, but they become critical at 10,000 feet. Above 10,000 feet, therefore, we need to supply additional oxygen by some kind of system. This additional oxygen, either in a mask or via cannulas, is added to the air that you're breathing. This works to attempt to restore the partial pressure of oxygen inside the lungs. It's therefore necessary to use supplemental oxygen anytime the aircraft is flown above 10,000 feet. Interestingly, for glider pilots, our workload, particularly our mental workload, is very high compared to other types of flying. And so we find that it's incredibly useful to actually start using supplemental oxygen below the 10,000 foot level. As I've mentioned before, oxygen is really a very useful drug and legal, so it makes a lot of sense to improve your performance, particularly for competition pilots. Glider pilots also tend to spend an awful lot of time above that 8,000 foot mark, particularly in really good soaring conditions. So we're spending a very long period of time, 4 or 5 hours, in that sort of zone where supplemental oxygen can make a big difference. Now, of course, many of you who are studying or who have studied human factors in flight will be aware of the insidious effects of hypoxia or lack of oxygen, in that the person who is suffering hypoxia will not know that they are. There are a number of symptoms, but one of them is euphoria. And so this leads to a situation where the pilot actually feels great, but in actual fact, the reason they feel great is because they are actually suffering from lack of oxygen. So along with that euphoria, you lose self-criticism and judgment abilities. Now, apart from those insidious effects, there's actually a really big threat in the sense that your loss of consciousness, the available time to you before you lose consciousness, can be incredibly short. At 18,000 feet, when you're doing absolutely nothing, which glider pilots in particular are not, is probably of the order of 20 minutes. And that can drop to just a few minutes as you go higher and higher. At 21,000 feet, it's 10 minutes. If you're active, 5 minutes. At 35,000 feet, depending on whether you're active or not, it's 3 minutes or 2 minutes. Really short periods of time. So you will lose consciousness very quickly. Now, those numbers that I gave you are just a guideline. The factors influencing the onset and intensity of hypoxia are numerous. They can be, whether you've had a decent sleep the night before, whether you've been drinking or using drugs, or whether you are a smoker. There's a whole bunch of different factors that can shorten those times quite considerably. Work, stress, just about anything. And of course, how long you spend at altitude and the rate of ascent are factors as well that can shorten those numbers considerably. Now, there's one other thing to consider, and this is described as the oxygen paradox, and that is the temporary worsening of symptoms if oxygen is delivered to someone who's already hypoxic. So if you are flying, for instance, at altitude and you've realized that you haven't got your oxygen on and you turn it on, you might feel worse. You might be tempted to turn it off. Don't. The paradox is due to a momentary reflex constricting of the arteries going to the brain in response to sudden increase in oxygen levels. So as you can see, the dangers of hypoxia are real, they're very insidious, and you should take all the care you can. And that's why, I've gone out of my way to make sure that I had this oxygen system available to me. The problem for a competition glider pilot is that if everybody else has oxygen and you don't, they might go above 10,000 feet on a good day and you can't. If you do, you'll be disqualified from the competition if you do so without oxygen. So, not to mention the dangers that we've just already talked about. So as a competition pilot, it becomes then necessary to have oxygen in the sense that you want to be able to go to the heights that others can go to so that you can compete on an equal footing. Now typically those heights would be up to about 14 or 15,000 feet on a typical thermal soaring day. So now that we've got an understanding of what hypoxia is, let's take a look at the equipment that we can use in our aircraft, the portable equipment that we can use in our aircraft. Now there are a couple of different types of systems that you can get for aircraft, and I'm going to be talking about the portable systems, in particular a mountain high system. So we'll have a look at that system, which isn't hard, if you like, hard piped or hard lined in the aircraft. It can be carried around and placed in the aircraft, so you can take it from one aircraft to another. And the particular system that I'm looking at is called the EDS system, for I think electronic delivery system, and it will deliver oxygen pulses when you inhale. So we'll have a look at that system. But before I do, if you aren't familiar with the Mountain High system, go and take a look. And I'm going to give a big shout out. This channel is not sponsored in any way by anybody, and certainly not by Go Soaring, but I want to give a big shout out to Al Sim at Go Soaring. I've known Al now 10 plus years, I think 10 years at least. I always deal with Al because he's always great to deal with. His service is exemplary, always. And this is just another example. He got this unit to me really quickly, and now I'm ready to go for the New South Wales State Championships. Now my glider did actually have an oxygen system in it at one point in time, and I got some of the bits and pieces, but I didn't get the whole system. So I just got rid of that and started again. So let's take a look at the Mountain High EDS system. Now the heart of the system is the EDS unit. This one's a one-person unit. You can get two-person units. And there are really three main modes, if you like. N, which is active at all pressures and is the best way to test your system. D, which is active at and above a selected pressure altitude. And F for use with face masks or when you find that you might need some more oxygen. The unit comes with batteries. A couple of AA batteries go in there. And while my cylinder isn't full at the moment, so I can't actually test it, I can test the unit by turning it on to the M setting. And I can also put it on the D settings, one for 5,000 feet and one for 10,000 feet. And then there's the F settings as well. Now I won't go into all of these settings just yet. We'll just take a basic look at the system. So you can Velcro this to the side of your canopy or stick it in a pocket or whatever you want to do. Comes with a couple of pieces of Velcro, probably not substantial enough, but I've got some pretty substantial Velcro. Of course, the main part of the system is the oxygen tank, and they come in various sizes. You can get aluminium tanks and you can also get composite tanks. What we also have is a regulator which screws onto the top of the bottle, and we have the piping here and a spare nipple. This is to connect the regulator to the EDS unit via the red socket. Then of course there's the piping to go from the unit to the cannula, which goes in the blue socket. And as well as the cannulas, the device also comes with a face mask for use at higher altitudes. So those are all the bits and pieces, and I will be fitting those in my glider very shortly. So if we look at the unit here again, the EDS unit, remember there are three main modes. There's the N mode, which is the mode that you can use to test your system. So when a unit is set to N mode, the unit will provide pulses of oxygen appropriate for an average healthy person using a cannula. And the flow starts at all altitudes. In other words, it just starts working. It is for use with a cannula, and the flow amount is a standard pulse, and it is altitude compensating. In the D mode, the D5 setting causes the unit to delay oxygen flow until you get to or above a pressure altitude of 5,000 feet. Now, for soaring pilots, we would tend to use that because soaring is a really mentally and physically taxing kind of way of flying. And also we're often, particularly in my case, competing. And so we want to stay mentally very sharp. This is the best drug you'll ever get, and it's perfectly legal. So we tend to use our oxygen from 5,000 feet up. The D10 setting delays the oxygen flow until you are at or above a pressure altitude of 10,000 feet. So that's when the flow starts. It's for use with a cannula. The flow amount is the standard pulse, and it's altitude compensating. You need to realize that it's pressure altitude, so it depends on the ambient pressure. Now the F modes, there are, 4 of them. F1 and 2 settings are for small ALP face masks. Settings 2 and 3 are for the medium-sized ALP face masks, and 3 and 4 are for the large masks. The F mode settings augment the amount of oxygen needed to compensate for the additional sort of dead space that's associated with a mask. They can also be used with the MH cannula in situations where more oxygen may be required over the normal N or D settings. The F mode settings are calibrated for use with the mountain high ALP face masks, so you should only use the mountain high masks with them, or the ALPS face masks. Flow start is at all altitudes in the F mode. You can use with a cannula or a face mask, and the flow amount is enriched, and it is altitude compensating. So remember, the F settings are for use with face masks or when requiring increased oxygen flow with a cannula. So that's the Mountain High EDS unit. I'm really looking forward to fitting this into my glider, and I would encourage you all to be aware of hypoxia and the dangers that it represents, and stay safe. So that's all from the Pilot Kimberley channel this episode. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell notification, give us a thumbs up. All of these things help the YouTube algorithm, and that means that more people get to see this channel. And while I'm speaking of that, I'm doing another version of this for my Soaring Sisters channel. If you think you might be interested in the sport of soaring, then go over to Soaring Sisters and subscribe there as well. I'm Kimberley Olsen. Bye for now.